So I don't know about you guys, but I got into front-end development because I want to make apps for people. And I saw that front end, it's the bit that people see, that's the bit that they love. But that love for making apps for people really got me caring, and I'm sure it'll get a lot of you guys caring about people's feedback, because you can't build great apps for people unless people think that the app is great. And you can't make it great without knowing what people like. So feedback is a really integral part of front-end development. It's not often something that front-end developers are directly responsible for. You know, in industry, in like a big team, you'll often be working with a designer, but it's so aligned to the mission, and it's so related to front-end that I think we couldn't have a front-end course without talking about, without exploring the world of how to get user feedback on a design, on an application, and how, and the different ways that can, that front-enders can be involved in that. So if we kind of think in terms of like the general process that applications get developed, it's often a very iterative project. People use buzzwords like agile, but I think it's just kind of natural to how exploration and often building products is quite exploratory. It's quite natural to exploration that it is an iterative process of planning, designing, building, and then testing that, getting feedback and feeding that back into planning. Feedback is really important in any software development process. It lets us refine the design and engineering requirements of the software. And often, you'll find that, one bit of the project is less important than you thought, or another bit's more important. You can refine the engineering requirements, deliver something better, deliver it in less time, build what users want, and don't spend time solving stuff that isn't important. And while, as I said before, front-enders, if you're working in a big team, often you won't be directly responsible. There might be a designer, or even sometimes like a specialized user experience researcher who's kind of is working on feedback. I think feedback is definitely something that everyone owns partially, and more importantly, everyone is impacted by it. In front-enders specifically, you're impacted in the way that it sets the requirements, and it often in a healthy organization, it would set the agenda for what you're going to build. It seeks to it lets people make better decisions based on feedback, and it lets you as a front ender also make better decisions just in your day-to-day programming. If you know, this is a feature that's really that sees a lot of usage, you pay more attention to things like errors or edge cases than if you know, this is a feature that isn't super used, so maybe let's just focus on getting it out the door. And then also, front enders are often the people who get tapped on the shoulder to help when there's the need to collect the feedback. Front enders can help build prototypes, mock something out really quickly so that you can get feedback on it, or they can do things like sending analytics events so that we can track buttons and things like that, or even asking people, like putting a prompt in the application. That would be a front end thing to build that feature. So front enders, feedback, very, very related and very integral to the process. So let's have a bit of a think about different types of feedback, because often you got to, you're in the product process and you're thinking, what type of feedback do I want to get, and how am I going to get it? So first, let's look at the types of feedback. I think feedback, there's so many different types, so it's often important to just think of the qualities of feedback that you're looking for. Sometimes when you're in a product process, you're looking for qualitative feedback. That's feedback about feelings rather than quantitative, which is about numbers. For instance, sometimes you might know exactly what you need to know. You just need to know like what happens more often. That would be quantitative. Sometimes you're not really sure how people are going to use the app, and you just want to see how they use it. You want to see if something makes sense. That would be qualitative feedback. There's different types of feedbacks based on the sample size. Sometimes, especially when you're looking at like quantitative things, or maybe things about like revenues and that type of things, you want to get feedback from all the users. But sometimes you just want a small sample. You're doing small experimental things, and you just want to get the feedback really quickly. Something to consider when getting feedback is sometimes you want to buy a sample, and sometimes you want a wide sample. If your application, is primarily in one market and you're looking to expand into another market, you might just want to get a buyer sample of just that other market. Sometimes you might want to get a wide sample of all of the users. Sometimes you want to like niche in and just look at the users who are complaining in support tickets. Sometimes you want to get a wide sample of even the users that are really happy, but might have small complaints that they wouldn't feel warranted writing a support ticket. Another important dimension of feedback is kind of what it requires in terms of your application. So some feedback such as analytics on an application, that can only happen once you've built the application. Whereas other feedback, such as doing a usability test on a prototype, that would only require a mock-up that might be sketched up by a designer, so that could happen pre-development. So with all of that said about the different types of feedback and the ways different feedback is useful for different things, it's then worth considering what are the different ways you can get feedback. And so I've tried to take some of these dimensions, and I've got on the vertical axis, we've got kind of, if it's going from like feedback that you can get from just like a couple of people, like your group of mates, all the way up to feedback that's looking at all users on the app. And then on the horizontal direction, we've got feedback that doesn't require any application to be made, and feedback that would happen post-release once you finish the application. And really, I think what I'm trying to say with this is there's a massive scale of so many different techniques. And obviously we can't cover them all today. I couldn't, like if you're looking at the pre-development large sample, you've got like market research. If you're looking at pre-development with a small sample, you're looking at surveys, interviews, those kind of small scale things, usability testing, which is something we're about to get into. And then on the other hand, if you're looking at post-release or like as the app gets further along in development, you can start to do usability testing on the app. You can start to have people use the app and prompt them inside the application for feedback, whether that's support tickets or just asking them, rate the application or do you have any feedback? You can look at analytics. You can look at business metrics, like is the app making any money? I mean, obviously that's a different type of feedback and it's useful for different things, but it can give you a sense of how the app is performing in the user's minds. And you can even, if the app is released and you just want a small sample, there are programs that will let you, with users' consent, record them using an application while they're using it just day to day, and you can get that kind of feedback. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that feedback, there's so many different ways to get feedback. Obviously, we can't look at all of them, but it's important to have a bit of an idea of all the different ways so that you can then think, all right, my app is at this point in development, so what are my options now? Or this is the type of feedback I need, so how much of the app do we need to build before we can start getting that feedback? It's going to depend based on the situation when you're building the app, how much you know, how much other people on your team know, and how much you've built as to what you can do. But I want to look at two examples, two types of ways to get feedback that I find particularly useful, that happens a lot in my work day to day, and this will vary. So the two ways I'm going to look at today is usability testing and app analytics. So first on to usability testing. What is usability testing? Well, I don't think we can answer that without knowing what is usability. So what is it? Usability is simply if an app is usable. Some key elements of usability are like, it's like as the dictionary says, but breaking that down a bit more, it's like, can the users understand the app? Can the users complete their task in the app? Because the app isn't usable if I can't use it to achieve my goal. Are the users efficient with the app? Do they feel like it was an easy thing to do or a hard thing to do? And are the users satisfied with the experience? So from that definition of usability, we can then get usability testing. And usability testing is simply a kind of method to test if an app is usable. Usability testing, though, typically happens with three main elements. We have a user, a task, and a facilitator. So a user is the person, is the participant in our user testing research. That's often what you call, when you run user testing, you'll call it sessions or research. They're the person who is going to use the app during our research. There's lots of different ways to get users in a usability testing session. You could yell it. You could go down on the street and wave and see if anyone wants to join you. You could email your user base of your application. You could ring your mum. There's so many different options. Obviously, there's some kind of key things you want to look out for. You want to look out for users that are representative of your audience. If you're making an application for like a CAD software for civil engineers, there's no use going and asking school children to use it, because that's not the goal of your application. So the users have to be representative. You obviously, you want them to think out loud, so that's something you want to ask them, because you want to be getting as much, you want to basically be in their brain, seeing how they use the application. We don't have brain reading technology, so you just have to ask them to think out loud. And also, it's really important that they're available to take part in the test, and that's often what dictates it, right? Like you might be making CAD software and for engineers, and you can only do usability testing on the people who will agree. And maybe if you're in a resource limited situation, it might be easy to get university students. So you end up going and getting like asking some, hiring some civil engineering students rather than hiring, full-time engineers because they might be more busy. For instance, those are some considerations to think about with users. With the task, so usability testing, usability is something you can only measure on a task. An app is only, like an app like Canva, terrifically usable graphic design software. It's not a very usable timer software because it's not a stopwatch, right? So usability is all about the task. So you want to pick a task that is representative of what you want your app to do. So for Canva, if we were doing usability testing, we'd ask people to design posters. We wouldn't ask people to find recipes on Canva because that's not what Canva does. You want to pick tasks that are realistic of what users might actually do. If you ask a civil engineer to test your civil engineer your CAD software, you'd probably want to ask them to do a civil engineering task rather than asking them to do like a 3D artwork task. Maybe your software supports both of those, but it's not going to be a really good usability. You're not going to learn a lot about how usable your software is for civil engineers to do civil engineering if you ask them to do something that isn't civil engineering. And you also want tasks that focus on your feature. So often big applications, lots of different features. But if you're only working on one feature and you only care about the results of one feature, then only ask about that. And you want to do tasks that feel natural. As I said, they're realistic for the user. If you're going to choose, you want to write tasks that make sense. So if we're asking someone, we want to test how usable Canva is for making a poster, or at a certain aspect of Canva, instead of asking someone to make a poster on like front-end web development, which might be a really obscure topic and it might make the task harder than it has to be, we just ask them to make a poster on a bake sale because most people are probably familiar with the concept of a bake sale. And then so you've got a user who's volunteering for your test. You've got a task, which is something you want to measure how usable it is to do. And then you need a facilitator, which is actually you. So the facilitator is the person who's going to run the testing sessions. The facilitator, or your designer or whoever's running the user testing, they're going to guide the user through the tasks. They're going to write down the user's feedback. They're going to collect observations about how the user does the task. The facilitation can be done either one-on-one in real life, like over a Zoom call, or the facilitation can be asynchronous. And we're about to look into an example of the asynchronous facilitation right now. So this example is actually a fun little real life example of some user testing I was involved in at Canva. So we have a feature, Canva Pro. It's got a feature Magic Resize, which lets you change the size of your design. You've got like an Instagram post and you want to make it a Facebook post. That's what this feature does. So in this user testing, we looked at, the goal of it was to identify ways to improve Magic Resize on desktop to make the feature more easy to use. And so we did what was called unmoderated user testing, usability testing scenario. We did an unmoderated usability testing study in this example. I'll get back at the end to what the difference between unmoderated and moderated is, but this is what we call unmoderated usability testing. So sweet. So the first thing that we had to do the usability testing, thinking back to the 3 elements of user, task, and facilitator. We got the facilitator. Now we need the tasks. So we write some simple scenarios. So this is an example of a real usability testing task. We say the scenario is you're a marketer using Canva to create a design for multiple social media platforms. So this is pretty good. We'll get back to it, but we got to remember now when we're recruiting our users, we have to make sure that they're people who probably understand what a marketer is and kind of are marketers, so that they get so they have some sense of what that user would do. And then in step 1, we ask them, please create an Instagram post by selecting a template or creating your own, then proceed to the next step. So this is in an unmoderated situation. So you see the image on the right, they're gonna see these steps in a little dialog box that just comes up on their screen. So that's why I asked them to proceed to the next step. But as you can see, these instructions are really vague, and that's quite important because we want to observe here. We want to observe how people go about doing these tasks. when we're writing these tasks, we're not telling them specifically what to do. We're not saying, click the red button to resize your design. We can't say that because that would defeat the whole purpose. The purpose is to understand, given these tasks that a general person would have when they're using Canva, people, it's pretty usual to want to create an Instagram post when you're using Canva. We want to understand how somebody thinks and goes about trying to achieve those tasks. So that's why these tasks are written in really vague language. They don't talk about the user interface that's on the screen, and they allow the user to show us their thought process of how they would go about doing these normal things. So the second step is written in that vein as well. It's step 2, let's now resize your design to post on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. So again, we're not telling them how to resize their design. That's what we're trying to learn. Remember, we're trying to figure out, is it a usable thing? Does resizing a design in Canva, is the button in the right spot? Does the button use the right language? Does it make sense? Are there any bugs that would prevent them from doing that? That's what we're trying to find out. So we're not telling them how to resize their design. We're not even telling them that there is a button to resize their design, right? We're just trying to watch them figure it out. But we're giving them a task, an objective to do. We don't want to watch people kind of randomly wander through the application and try every button. We want to watch them do a specific task, because most people who come to Canva have a specific task in mind. In usability testing, we've kind of had to fake this a little bit. We're basically hiring these users as actors. They're acting out what a user would do who's trying to create a Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest post. And we're just kind of watching them to see how other people interpret our product. So there were some more steps. And then at the end of the session, we asked them, thanks for taking your time to help us. What frustrated you the most? And what did you like? What would you change? That kind of stuff. So that's what the tasks look like in a usability testing scenario. Then we recruit the users. So in this case, we used a service called usertesting.com. We chose 5 users to take part. They were paid. 5 is a general, that's a pretty normal amount. Remember, we're going to have to watch these users and listen to them after they've recorded and gone through the tasks. So if we have 50, that's 50 people I have to listen to. Generally, 5 is an industry accepted number, because if you only did 1 or 2 users, there wouldn't be enough variation. Someone might just be totally confused. It would be too small of a sample. Whereas if you did 50, that would be too long to watch. So 5 is kind of the Goldilocks number for usability testing. So they record their screen and then they send us back the videos. And then, we watch the recordings. And this is what all of this setup was for, right? So, we looked at this. There were 4 steps in this test, and we only talked about 2 before. And we looked, was the person able to complete the steps successfully? Put this in a bit of a table. We've gone through all the users or participants, and we've kind of made some dot points. The first user didn't realize that there was a pop-up blocker because they didn't read the message, and that meant that they got lost, and whatever. And then from this, we've now had 5 random people use our application, and this gives us some great insight into what if a real user was trying to use the application, what kind of stumbling blocks would they have, what kind of issues would they encounter. We can kind of look at these 5 users as a sample of that, and we can draw conclusions to make insights. Sweet. So that was our first usability test that we've run through. Awesome. So this is what, as I said before, this was a moderated usability test. So moderated usability tests are really great. They're quite simple, as we just saw. They're quite simple to run. Obviously, there's a lot of craft that goes into running great usability tests, and that's something that if you were running lots of usability tests, you get better at. But yeah, they're quite simple to run. So in the moderated test, as we just saw, we're writing the tasks, and then we're throwing it across the wall, and then somebody else is completing the tasks. Either they're completing them against a real application, or they're completing them on a prototype. In a moderated usability test, it's a little bit different, because the user and the facilitator sit together. They're either in a room together, or they're in a Zoom call together. In a moderated usability test, the facilitator can ask more follow-up questions. So when it's unmoderated, the user's recording, right? We have to hope that they've just said all the right stuff and that they've really articulated what they were thinking. In a moderated session, we can ask what they were thinking. Obviously, this means that there's more time. I have to sit in and watch. I can't watch it at 2x speed, right? You have to be there 1x speed sitting with them. But it can be useful because you can ask them more. You can ask them pointed questions. You can prompt them. You can really get their feedback. And that's really useful when the test is more exploratory. In that example, we had a very specific task that we wanted the users to complete. So it was a quite good fit for an unmoderated test. But if we were earlier in the product development process and the idea of the feature was a bit more vague, we wanted to get people's feedback. We just wanted to know generally what they thought about the feature and if it made sense. A moderated session might be more appropriate because we can ask more follow-up questions and we can really dig into what they're thinking. I think moderated sessions, though, are interesting because I think they're actually a bit harder to run. Moderated sessions, when you're in an unmoderated session, the facilitator can't explain to the user, oh no, this is how the feature actually works, right? Because the user just sees the steps. You can't jump in and be like, but you've missed the most important button. You can't do that because they're on the computer screen. They're not actually talking to you. They're just going to send you the recording. In a moderated session, just as any person who's nice as you guys are, if you're watching someone struggle to use an application, which often you are, right? Usability testing, you test terrible applications to get them to be great. You test terrible ideas to get them to be great, sorry. When you're watching someone struggle, it can be really hard. You have to sit there and you have to watch them through their pain and watch them try everything and really explore their thought process. It can be very tempting to jump in and be like, but this is how it works, but there's just this one button, or to try and explain your design almost, or explain or try and convince them that the feature is good. Facilitating is an art, and that's really something to be aware of, because usability testing is about the user. It's about letting the user talk. It's about hearing them and watching their thought process. Facilitators have to resist the urge to talk because it's not a time about them. If they wanted to talk, they could just talk to their team. Sweet. So that's kind of my wrap on usability testing. There's moderated, there's unmoderated. It's about tasks. It's about tasks, users, and the facilitator. Let's go into something totally different. Let's really shift gears here. Data. Rather than interviewing people to try and get an idea of if an app is usable or if an app is good in their eyes, we can just answer questions by looking at how people actually use the application. Obviously, data is for a different time than usability testing. While usability testing kind of lets us explore, get general feedback, kind of find out new things and new ways that users struggle, data is much more useful for answering specific questions that we have. Data is much more useful when you care about how much rather than what, for instance. It can tell you when something's happening more than expected, less than expected, but it's probably not as good at finding new things compared to watching someone use it like you can in usability testing. So how does a data feedback process work? Obviously, we're going to start with like app interactions. The app interactions in like our front end code, we send analytics events. The analytics events get stored in like a database, or what's often called in industry a data warehouse. We can then run queries on the database using SQL. I'm sure a lot of you guys have done like a databases class before, but we're just talking very general terms here. From those queries, we can get some metrics, and with those metrics, we can analyze the metrics, and then we can get insights and new ideas for our application. I'll walk through. I'm going to have a look at all these steps of the process. We're not going to look at them in order. But first, I just wanted to kind of point out that this is, obviously, data is such a buzzword in the tech industry because there's so many ways it's beneficial. We're only looking at a very small part of data in this example. I've grabbed this diagram from a terrific Andreessen Horowitz article looking at, quote, emerging architectures for modern data infrastructure. And as we see, while we're looking at just collecting analytics events from applications, a modern data infrastructure in like a tech company probably has all sorts of data sources, all sorts of different ways that flows into the warehouse or the lake, and then all sorts of platforms for querying and generating dashboards, graphs, metrics, all sorts of things. So we're just going to look at this slither of data today that I think is really applicable for front enders and something that comes up a lot. Sweet. So what are some common metrics? Obviously, it's hard to know what data we want to collect or how we want to analyze it without knowing what metrics we want to calculate. So metrics are simply, it's a fancy word for an aggregation of raw data. It's like a calculation you do over raw data to measure something. So simple metrics you can do are counting things. You can count the number of times a page is visited. You can count the number of distinct users who've clicked a button or used a feature in some way. You can count. There's also more complicated metrics. I mean, those are the two really core ones. But then you can count things like how long people have used something, how often people use something, the session duration, that's how long something is used. You can divide numbers by one another. This is just maths. You can divide numbers by one another. You can calculate, a nice common web metric is something called the bounce rate, which is the percent of users who, for instance, open a page but leave it very quickly or don't do anything on the page. So bounce rates are a nice metric. You can use metrics like activation rates or completion rates, and those are things like how many people sign up or visit your product page and then end up actually using your product, where like activating means doing the most important thing in your product. So maybe for a bank, they would define activation as someone who comes to the bank, they sign up, and then they deposited their first dollar in the bank. So there's so many different rates and metrics, but those are just some common ones. But what do we do with these metrics? Well, we often want to compare them to create insights. So for instance, we can compare metrics across different app versions. We can say, when we put an upgrade prompt in this part of the application, X% more people were likely to upgrade, but Y% were more likely to leave the application. So you can compare metrics between the same metric between different versions of the app, and you can compare the metrics to each other and weigh up and make decisions. When you're comparing metrics across different versions of the app, this is something that's often called A/B testing. So you have two different versions, maybe one where the button's red, one where the button's blue, or in this case, one where the upgrade prompt is shown and one where the upgrade prompt is not shown. You randomly give people, so like half of the people will randomly get variant A, half of the people will randomly get variant B, and you see which version has the better metrics. You can also use metrics just in the absolute sense. So you could look at a metric. This was actually a funny real story where we had 20% of users clicking a button when the application was in such a state that clicking the button did nothing. And that metric meant because 20% of the users were clicking a button and it did nothing, we were pretty convinced that it was actually a problem with where we put the button. So we try to rejig the button so that users weren't as confused. So yeah, those are some different ways we can use metrics. Obviously, in order to use metrics, we need the raw data to calculate the metrics. And the raw data, it's like everything, you got to get it from the source to get good data. So as front-enders, this is often how we interact with metrics. You can use a library such as analytics.js to provide an API that lets you track events. So events they're just a record that something happened. So for instance, if I was making a search page like Google, Google always had very complicated analytics, but at a very basic level, we might track that a search result was shown and we would include the ID. So the event name would be like search result shown, the ID, the properties would be like ID, whatever, and then maybe additional information about how the result was shown. And then if the user clicks the result, we'd call it again, we call the function again, and we'd say search result clicked and include an ID. But what is this analytics function? Well, we often use, there's lots of common libraries out there, and it's worth giving them a look. There's things like analytics.js from Segment, which provide an API from this. What they often do is they'll make a HTTP request to a server in this like data pipeline, and the server will then store the event in the data warehouse or the database. So what does it look like once it's stored in the data warehouse? Often, and this actually came as a real surprise to me when I got into the industry, that the data warehouse will just often store a raw log of all of the events. So, in this use case, we just have timestamp, user ID, event name, and the event properties, and that would just be it. Really simple. We're literally just storing all the events as they come in. It is important to realize, I feel like I do have to point out the ethical and legal considerations for something like this. If you are storing all these events, in many countries, you are legally required to offer ways for users to delete their events because it's their data. For instance, with GDPR in Europe, or that California's similar legislation. Additionally, things like cookies in Europe also has regulation and there's ethical considerations. And if you're storing like personally identifiable information, there's just ethical considerations around, is it okay to be storing that information? But this is often just the way you do it. You store all the events. These events I've represented here as a table, because often these events are stored in a SQL database. Commonly, we don't use the normal SQL databases that you might be familiar with from a databases course. So it's quite rare to see something like Postgres or MySQL used in a large used as a data warehouse application in the industry, because those applications are often optimized for what's called online transaction processing, or OLTP. That means they're optimized for low latency, right? Because when you visit a website, you want to be able to get the data for that page really quickly. On the other hand, analytics data warehouse software, it's SQL, it's often SQL as well. So you're writing SQL queries, you're storing data in tables, but it's often called online analytics processing, or OLAP. And what that means is that it's much higher latency, but because like you're not querying it to load the web page, but it's much higher throughput, because when you are querying this data, there's so much data, you need to be able to query lots of it. And common data warehouse software where you would be able to create these tables and store them are things like Snowflake, Google's BigQuery, or Amazon's Redshift. So yeah, it's surprisingly simple. And through that, the combination of, I'll just go back. The combination of collecting analytics on the front end, sending it into the data warehouse, then calculating metrics allows you to create insights and get feedback based on what your users are doing in the app. So I think that's all for us today. Yeah, so feedback is really exciting. There's so many different options, so many different types of feedback, and it's really important to have some sense of your feedback buffet, so you know what to feast on at the right time during your app development process. Usability testing, for instance, lets us observe a small sample really intimately, and it's great. So because it's so intimate, it's great for uncovering new issues, things you wouldn't have thought about, the what of the feedback. On the other hand, analytics it's something that happens later in that you can do later in the process, because you need to have built the app to collect analytics on it. But it lets you observe all of your users and understand the magnitudes of issues, as well as comparing small differences, for example, to optimize through A/B testing.